Loudcest. This gets no introduction, but you pretty much are afraid that I was going to be talking about this, and there was literally no avoiding of it no matter where you go in this fandom, and this ends up becoming the edge or the underneath the bottom of the iceberg when it comes to shipping in general. No matter what, you can't avoid it. No matter how you instantly type in the Loudcest, you'll always see one pic of it, of either Lincoln being shipped with his sisters, or basically something more. An NSFL material, that is. Okay. I will admit that Loudcest is really one of the worst ships, especially when most of the material that we've seen from it is in safe for work material. Well, kids can instantly see this type of stuff. And it's honestly difficult to assume that this type of stuff would still happen if the writing of the show is good. But on the other hand, I always think that in mind, since that I really wanted to have bonds between Lincoln and his sisters in the later seasons, and since that we are getting less and less of that, the romance involving Loudcest in the fandom isn't any better, which for me personally I can still draw the line towards. But on the other hand, if the main show isn't taking Lincoln's bond with his sister seriously after witnessing it countless of times to the point that Lincoln being with his friends is literally the issue that I have with this, to where the whole Loudcest material is still an afterthought. That doesn't mean that it's incorrigible to do, but at the same time, it's still an afterthought. The more I look into the show, into understanding of how that it just lacks the bonds of Lincoln and his sisters, it really gives me the impression that even if they attempted to have the characters fall in love with each other, it would probably be in the same format of Lincoln being with his friends while taking his time away from his sisters. So it seems to me that even if you look at the show differently with the whole Loudcest material in mind, it's also the direction, well, they can't be able to make Lincoln's bonds with his sisters any better if they include romance. And I'm not saying this because I know that this is a fact, it's still an opinion. All we know is that Nickelodeon will never include incest in this show, no matter what. Even with Chris Savino doing an incest comment that centers around the animals being into the mother in some other way, I'm always thinking that if this actually happened in this show, then this show would have been something else entirely if it was for adults. And I wouldn't be able to enjoy it that way. So, in a way, incest in this show wouldn't be enjoyable if the writing is that terrible. In fact, I would say that it would probably be more worse and over the top in comparison to the other bad episodes from the show. But I'm not gonna lie, it's still impossible to think of what this show would have been more improved if they actually care about the bonds that Lincoln had with his sisters. Sometimes I'm thinking too much into it when it comes to this type of material, but every time I think of Loudcest in mind, even though I shouldn't, it just makes me convinced that Loudcest still does a better job because they managed to have Lincoln being paired with his sisters more. Granted, when it comes to having nothing to do with Loudcest in general, that's another thing, but since that people barely pay less attention towards that and mostly on Loudcest, societies on the internet, sophisticated communities, is what is making this type of stuff normalize. Not in a encouraging way, but when I say normalize, mainly the fact that you're just getting sick of witnessing the same material over and over again in the later seasons with the same aggression, to where you can't be able to get anything good out of. Like, in seasons 4, despite having good episodes here and there involving Lincoln and his sisters, after that, we barely have any bonds between Lincoln and the other sisters, to the point that it just becomes difficult to take them seriously as siblings, and it's most likely the fact that they're basically kids in an apartment, in a house that is. And the fact that this show just tries to convince you that this is all part of family despite not owning it, when it comes to Lincoln himself, which I do admit that the other sisters get along, with Lincoln being the major draw in all this, this is also where the Lincoln fans, while some are not into Loudcest, can't be able to take much more of the problems and redundancy in the later seasons to make them convinced that Lincoln is part of this family, and the whole Lincoln being an outcast is becoming more accurate. From someone who actually sit through the later seasons of this show, while the majority of fans moved on, specifically fans who enjoyed the earlier seasons before season 4, you can really tell that they just can't be able to take this show at face value if they haven't watched the later seasons. And they probably have the same opinions that they had in the past after stopping at season 4 when Scored from season 5 came around. And the more I look into these episodes, unlike other people, the more I see on Lincoln's bonds with his sisters have becoming less and less. No one is ever going to agree with me on this, since that some of them always get the idea that Lincoln is different than the other sisters when it comes to designs, but this also convinces me that it's hard to find Lincoln being relatable with his sisters, even if he's supposed to be relatable towards his sisters. When it comes to him pranking like Luann, when it comes to him attempting to do something else that centers around his sisters and whatnot, honestly, when you think of siblings, specifically Dipper and Mabel from Gravity Falls, they're all different, and they don't get along easily with them having different interests. But at the very least, they at least attempted to make their bond work in some other capacity. Granted, I've been thinking of making a video centering around that for a while, but again, it's low on my list. My point is that every time I look at Lincoln and his sisters in the later seasons, even though I do want to see Lincoln and Luna bonding, it makes me convinced that they really don't have a lot in common in comparison to the earlier seasons, where they may have something in common. I always try to look at the episodes in a different perspective, but no matter what, my perspective really changed years later after being burned out from this show, to where that if I actually took Loudcest seriously, it's not going to make a difference of how that in the show itself they're not even committing on making the bonds of Lincoln and his sisters work, when the majority of it is just centering around fighting and fighting. And if the truth is that you can't stop fighting in the Loud House, it doesn't change the fact that it sacrifices any further wholesome moments between Lincoln and his sisters. For me, it gets exhausting. Really, really exhausting. Looking into the point of view of the other characters isn't going to change the fact that it's the same thing we've seen in the past with no nuance. And all I can say is that if this show clearly can't be able to do something different, then why should I take any of this stuff seriously for how infamous it is? Like I said, I'm not encouraging Loudcest, but on the other hand, if people are into this stuff because they either want comfort from it, other than just causing trouble, then I can't really blame them if they're not getting that type of comfort in a minimum level in the main series. Even though that they're all wholesome artists who made wholesome arts, they get overshadowed immediately to the point that if you attempted to be like those people, stuff like this would still be happening to the point that you just can't keep going, to the point that you're just getting exhausted and fed up with stuff like this happening and so much negativity. I am doing the tamiest material involving Loudcest, despite the kissing, but every time that someone brings up Loudcest, no matter where it is, they're not wrong, but at the same time, they're still beating a dead horse. At this point, when every single artist who does this type of stuff, which the stuff that I'm showing you right now isn't that infamous, it really makes me to believe that no one isn't weird. Like, if everyone wasn't weird, then we would have had the most healthiest fandom ever. But unfortunately, there's really no avoiding any of this no matter what you do, to the point that you just completely just pile on all of this to, well, that what else is new? Like, you hate Loudcest and no issues towards that, but on the other hand, it's literally the same thing that we've seen in the past. Just like in the show where the characters get regressed. Even if you can admit on the fact that you have the same standards of being into this type of material, if anything, I'm going to assume that stuff like this only keeps happening because people are not really committed on doing their own commitment properly. Because, in all honesty, being honest about it is really redundant and just gets so overwhelming to the point that what you get when it comes to backlash just becomes really miserable in a way where it just gets so redundant hearing it over and over again. As I've mentioned, involving Lincoln being the ladies' man, the not safe for work material is one of the most popular things in this fandom, and that also applies to the sisters, specifically the older characters, Lori, Lenny, and Luna. If I'm going to be real, thinking about the shippings of the female characters together, it's mainly of them being in the same room with each other. Specifically, Lori, Lenny, even though Lori is no longer in the building, and Luann and Luna. Even though that those ships aren't as safe, it doesn't change the fact that if people do these types of stuff because they're so into it, then I am not going to admit that there's no way to make a proper bedroom episode. Well, you have comfort that has nothing to do with the character being depressed. That's just basically my take of what to do on doing a comfort moment between two sisters, and yet at the same time, really difficult to take into the consideration that you prevent incest in those types of moments. Despite all the arts that I've shown you, most of them have nothing to do with Loudcest. But on the other hand, if they're not getting more attention compared to Loudcest itself, really, it's hard to not think of Loudcest as non-normalizing with how complicated it is to see Lincoln as not the ladies' man in front of characters like his older sisters. If I watched this show back in 2016, which is around the time while I was building up my YouTube channel, I would say for a fact that these bonds are healthier with the incest in mind being the cause in all of this. But since that I'm not those types of fans who enjoyed the show in the beginning when the show was brand new, I'm sorry. Just because that you keep the same opinions that you had back in 2016 doesn't automatically mean that people like me are gonna have the same opinions as yours. Since that I also have different point of views in the show itself, especially in the Oreo seasons. And since I keep the opinions of the Leo seasons as it is, really, if I have the same mindset as someone who enjoyed the show back in 2016, I would have a childhood of this show, which I don't. Which my childhood would be short-lived since by the time that this show premiered, it's only 20 days until my birthday while I turn 18, so in all honesty, it's kind of odd thinking that I would have had a small childhood by remembering the episodes airing around that time, which isn't really saying a lot when I'm entering adulthood. If I'm going to attempt to address each Loudcest ship in some shape or form, it would be a little too difficult because those opinions would also imply Lincoln's relationship with his sisters, despite how little there are in the Leo season. So, obviously, you pretty much know that I'm going to be talking about the most infamous ship when it comes to Loudcest, not including the Longo sisters, Lincoln and Lin Jr. This is honestly the worst Loudcest ship when it comes to relationships. Like, loving is a different level, which is honestly the main topic of what people are against in this material, but when it comes to a relationship level, I can't be able to take this seriously. If you want my description in all this, it's kind of like the Lincoln and Ryan ship, but Lin Jr. is in Ryan's position, and with it being incest, it's no better. To well that after witnessing Lin Jr.'s character time and time again that she always picks on Lincoln and she is just insufferable to enjoy as a character if you ignore the infamous moments that she did in the Oreo seasons. I don't even see the appeal of this whatsoever because this is a lot more extreme compared to Ryan pranking and bullying Lincoln. Truth be told, the fact that we never had an episode of Lin Jr. and Ryan facing off each other is really a huge missed opportunity, since that would have been a good episode to have which character is stronger, but on the other hand, when it comes to shipping battles, I don't blame the Lincoln and Ryan shippers wanting to outclass the Lincoln and Lin Jr. shippers. No matter which episode I revisit, regardless of Lin Jr. being in the right in some cases, in the majority of them, I don't even see the sibling bond between Lincoln and Lin Jr. And the fact that the live action series, specifically in the second season, managed to succeed on that, this shouldn't be an afterthought, but at the same time, it's too extreme to overlook it, or even admit that this is the best Loudcest shipped, because it is never the best Loudcest shipped if we ever do a ranking of Loudcest ships, if we ever are committed to admit which ship is slightly better. Even though that I have positive things to say involving Lin's ships in some cases, it doesn't really change the fact that this ship in particular really doesn't do much favors for her. Well, the positivity in this is just mainly people just can't be able to ignore the moments involving Lincoln eating a sandwich while Lin Jr. is also eating that sandwich. And the Space Invaders episode where Lincoln and Lin Jr. share a bed, since that Lin Jr. refuses to sleep in the same room with Lucy. And don't even get me started on Lin Jr.'s letter to Santa. Well, she wants Lincoln to be put inside of a crate. putting this all in perspective of the whole shipping between the two, I really side those people who still consider that naughty more than what Lincoln did in Naughty or Nice. And at this point, thinking of it this way is just going to raise more questions. And the fact that the people who worked on Naughty or Nice are shippers or supporting the shippers of Lincoln and Lynn are clearly Loudcest supporters in some way. Not completely if they're doing it in a romantic way, but at the same time, even in a romantic way, there's just so much going on that it's just difficult to process on this whole shipping thing entirely, along with the other Loudcest ships. It just seems to me that this ship's popularity is mainly just wanting to see the good in Lynn, but at the same time, not this way of good. Especially thinking about the Rewrite the Stars comic. Like, this normalizing incest just makes it more confusing and a lot more bizarre and disturbing to think that this ship is that popular when it comes to Loudcest. Even though that my complaints of Lincoln not bonding with the sisters is mostly indicating the toxic environment of not only the white team from the show, but also the fan base itself who think mostly otherwise. The whole shipping of Lincoln along with his sisters really feels like a way of showcasing of what they can do better, even though it's not the right thing to do. When it comes to the shipping between Lincoln and Lola, truth be told, if these two ever attempted to bond, it wouldn't be possible. And considering that there are people who like the bonding between Lincoln and Lola, and there are some who aren't normal, I really get the impression that it's probably the closest we're gonna see these two characters connect with each other, just not in a healthy way. And not in the healthy way of what the show describes the relationship between Lincoln and Lola. For the most part, thinking of that mentality is more understandable, despite being the disturbing truth of it all. It really does showcase that even in the show, you can't be able to accept literally everything due to the bad decisions that they make, and even if you're never going to be on board with my opinion of what I just stated, that's just basically what makes this show a little difficult to take Lincoln's bond with his sister seriously when you include incest from the fandom. Like, if you can't separate that from the show due to how sensitive you are, that's fine. But on the other hand, if you actually sit through the show and you mostly get sick and tired of seeing the same thing repeatedly over and over again with no nuance, which is something that this show lacks when it comes to Lincoln and his sister's bonding, despite the fact that they shouldn't bond all the time, then I can't be able to take most of the sad fan art at face value, especially the context, because with how many times that we've seen that a lot, it's not overrated, but at the same time, it's not really on the same levels as Loudcest when it comes to attention. Because as far as I'm concerned, that actually gets more attention than the sad fan art that people are just neglected to admit. Yes, websites banned Loudcest, to the point that they want other arts to be acceptable when they're not inappropriate or too inappropriate. And I will admit that I always think that the other ships are superior over Loudcest. I didn't praise some of these ships for nothing throughout this video, but on the other hand, it doesn't change the fact that we are living in a reality that, with how poor the show has becoming, even when we're reaching to its 10th anniversary, Loudcest has become a zombie. A unhealthy zombie that you shouldn't come near, but at the same time, No matter how you beat it down, it's never going away. Never ever. And that really doesn't apply to the other ships that are healthier, to the point that you just can't be able to admit that even if they're better than Loudcest, they're still not gonna be able to get the same attention as this. I wish I could say a lot when it comes to Lincoln's ships involving his mother along with the other mother characters, but then again, considering that this is also a lost cause, let's just say that regardless of what Rita is doing to Lincoln in the Not Safe for Work material, you can't convince me of what Rita is doing in the main show by supporting Lincoln is any better due to how little we have gotten from it. That doesn't automatically mean that that type of Loudcest is better than that, but at the same time, it's draining. Like, if I did a video centering around Loudcest alone instead of including it in this video, it would probably be unfocused, and the idea of comparing that type of material over the moments in the show wouldn't be fair whatsoever, especially since that this shipping, while Infamous is still in the same topic in the shipping category of this video's existence. Hence why that including this in this video is really important. The only thing that we can hope for a future cartoon that has the same premise as the Loudcest when it comes to a big family with multiple sisters is that it better not be popular like the Loudcest was. Honestly, regardless of that cartoon being a rip-off of some sort, it's probably gonna be the way it was written and how the popularity was gained in the same veins as the Loudcest has gotten nearly 10 years ago, because it made me see more onto why Loudcest has become more noticeable due to the many gores, and the fact that it has a direction that makes it unintentional for fan bases to have a darker side that we can't avoid. It's gonna be really difficult for a new cartoon to do something like this, which is for the best, but in all honesty, if it's literally the only way to prevent something like a potential name for incest for that cartoon to happen, it's really for the best. It may be sad to think that that possible cartoon won't become a thing, but in all honesty, incest is a zombie in any other cartoon fandom to where that possible cartoon is no victim. Incest in cartoon fandoms are broken beyond belief, to where you can't be able to admit that it's beyond repaired by getting rid of it and admitting that it should have never been exist, because it always exists in any other cartoon fandom involving families. And the Loud House is really an indicator of that category. I do feel bad for the people feeling uncomfortable of Loudcest, especially those who can't stand it, but with how of a lost cause the fandom is and the quality dip of the show itself, you can't make me convinced that this is worth discussing about in a more serious matter in comparison to the other incest ships from other cartoons. I'm sorry, but that's just basically how I view it from this show due to how everything is structured. And when it comes to the cousins, specifically Shelby, even though that I am looking forward to the season 10 episode centering around her and Lincoln when it comes to having the Loud cousins moving next door to the Loud family's house, honestly, people are not gonna have attentions on that due to the fandom instantly thinking about Loudcest involving Lincoln and Shelby. Less said about that the better, because Shelby really feels like a character that deserves better development and more respect, which is insane a lot considering the less screen time we've seen of her, because that's literally the only way to make a character like her likable if we don't know everything about her when it comes to her negative traits. So after going through nearly all of the ships and romance from this franchise, we're gonna be wrapping it all up with one more ship that is a crossover ship. Crossover ships are mostly infamous in some cases, but when it comes to the Loudcest itself, this crossover ship I didn't get upon witnessing it, but it made more sense as time went by. Lincoln and Velocica. This is really one of the most infamous crossover ships ever, to the point that you just question onto how it got popular in two fandoms of Helluva Boss and the Loudhouse. But as time went by, witnessing more of the fandom from the Loudhouse, it just goes to show that they're treating Lincoln as the worst character when it comes to the choices that he made, and with some people shipping him with Velocica when it comes to taking Lincoln to hell, it all makes sense, knowing full well that those fans don't treat Lincoln as an angel, as some fans say otherwise. This really feels more accurate the more I look into it, and hence why it's the only crossover ship I'm discussing, judging of how people would most likely want me to talk about it in this video, even though that some of them probably never watched Helluva Boss before. Now, I did watch Helluva Boss, including the third episode where Velocica made her debut, but back then I wasn't a Loudhouse fan, so thinking this pairing was extremely unlikely, and I would have had a different perspective on not only the Loudhouse, but also Lincoln's character by that time. What really makes this ship really bizarre isn't because of the age gap, because we've already tackled the age gap portion in my Lincoln section, but it's mainly the fact that this pairing is becoming more sense, to the point that the more we see Lincoln being portrayed in the later seasons of the Loudhouse, and when it comes to his toxic hate-dom going against him, to where there's no good for him to be shipped with girls his age. Honestly, if you want something worse than him being paired with the other girls older than him, including his sisters, then I guess Velocica is the alternative that trumps it all, to be honest. It's an exaggeration, yes, but every time I think about Loudcest or the age gap ships in the Loudhouse, it's unavoidable. But when it comes to this particular ship, this really felt like the ultimate unavoidable ship, to where you don't understand it, to the point that you really want Lincoln to be shipped with someone his age. But for someone like Velocica, honestly, the more I think about her, and when it comes to how she was written in Helluva Boss, it always gives me the impression that people who like this ship just wants Lincoln to be happy in some other way, and if it's the only way for him to go to hell, this is literally the ultimate alternative. It's stupid to think about, but at this point, I'm more convinced that if Lincoln isn't going to be paired with someone that isn't going to have any harmony for himself or peace, then I'm pretty sure that he has no other choice. And if he killed himself, then it's either the best thing that can happen to him if he doesn't go up to heaven. And with the Helluva Boss and Hazbin Hotel fandom being problematic just as much as the Loudhouse when it comes to toxicity, this feels like these two shows are relatable, despite the fact that one show is for kids while the other is for adults. And the storyline centering around Blitzo and Velocica, honestly, I did review the Sins Miss episode where Blitzo is being paired with a guy, but on the other hand, if he witnessed a boy getting the hearts of his former girlfriend or former wife, then it really makes me convinced that he would probably be confused rather than being furious that it's not a guy that is close to Verosika's age. The fan art that I've gathered for this section is mostly you-know-what, but on the other hand, the people who do these fan art really is appreciating and find mesmerization of Verosika and Lincoln together. I mean, I would get to my point on the idea of Lincoln being shipped with other girls later, because for me that is slightly better than this, but on the other hand, I'm not going to lie that if this is the happiness that Lincoln gets from the point of view of these shippos, then I can't really argue with that. Even though that there are some fans who really want Lincoln to be good and they prefer him to be a good boy despite doing bad choices, it doesn't really change the fact that whenever I see this type of stuff, it makes me convinced that there are different ways of giving Lincoln happiness and have him be a different character than the character that we want him to be in our fanfics and fan art. Even though that I'm not a fan of the humor of Hell of a Boss, which does apply to Has-Been Hotel, it doesn't change the fact that, like some ladies in the Loud House, Verosika is attractive. And if this is also an indication that the people shipping Lincoln with Verosika is they'll self-insult into Lincoln, honestly, Lincoln probably has the perfect crossover ship, because I don't even think that would apply to other crossover ships in other cartoons, considering that Blitzo is more of a different character that isn't considered a ladies' man. So this ideal in mind always makes me convinced that if you have someone like Lincoln and you have a show that doesn't really fit in the Loud House nature, but you only use it for a crossover ship, then Lincoln probably has something in hell that most likely his family or friends would not understand since it doesn't exist. But considering that magic material exists in the Loud House, honestly, our headcanons of Hell of a Boss existing in the show is still in our headcanons that people will not get until they witness it out of nowhere. But on the other hand, the ships of the Loud House and the show itself, it is disturbing, yes, but on the other hand, it still made some sense in a way while some weird fans want Lincoln to be shipped with someone with an older girl and someone who is part of his family. Even though that it's still a red flag, I wouldn't even prefer the idea of Lincoln going to hell while having a wife down there, because I never found hell appealing in Has-Been a Hotel and Hell of a Boss. As in, doing fan art or fanfiction of it, because while I may enjoy the story of it all, it doesn't change the fact that you're gonna be witnessing the same problems from the Loud House fandom when it comes to toxicity, to the point that sitting through this show was difficult for me to get back to because of stuff like this. And if I have to encounter people's opinions that are negative, which are gonna be difficult to find positive ones, then I wouldn't even have the consideration of shipping one of the Loud House characters with the Has-Been Hotel or Hell of a Boss characters, because it's really unlikely. People have limits, and those limits can go too far, but even if it's disturbing in a way where you just can't be able to admit that it's not right, it's also the alternative that they would have taken rather than just sticking to something that is more popular, because it's really difficult for me to see popular crossover ships that just feels out of the norm to where it's gonna take way too long for me to grow accustomed towards, while other ships in this show maybe grew to them easily. Well, aside from ships like these, the Loudcest and whatnot. But the point is that this crossover ship is something that I've learned more about, but it doesn't automatically mean that I ship Lincoln with Velocica. Like, I will probably have a good time shipping Lincoln with the other characters in the Loudcest better than this, knowing how little interest I have with Helluva Boss, even though that it's really not that bad of a show if you ignore literally the toxicity from it. Negativity is one thing, but toxicity really overshadows the good of the franchise. And considering that there was a lot of women in the Loudhouse, if I had to pick either having Lincoln being the ladies' man or having him being shipped with Velocica, I would pick the former. Like, there was many ways you can do stuff like this, even if it's wrong, but there was somehow worse things than this, to the point that it just makes you convinced that the unexpected can really make you more confused and have your head hurt for thinking more things that you don't need to know. People, specifically the Lincoln and Velocica shippers, will never accept my opinion if they're that toxic, but I have limits. And for me personally, crossover ships are slightly overweighted to the point that preferring ships in the show itself is more than enough. And literally the only other crossover ship I can think of is Luann and Steven. I've came across fan art of these two on DeviantArt, and the only assumption that I can come up is Luann being go happy like Steven minus the puns and jokes, but that's literally all I can think of. Nothing much to it, to where that it's difficult to think of other ways to make this ship work for your own amusement. But for being a Steven and Connie shipper, this really feels the most out of nowhere crossover ship that you can think of. Like, if I do more of these types of videos from other cartoons, there will be less crossover ships, mainly the fact that you just question how these ships are drew, which isn't really offensive if it's not Loudcest or any of that type of stuff, but on the other hand, the weirdness is too much for you to process your own opinion. But I've dragged out this crossover section long enough. That's that. That's my video of the despair, romance, and shipping of the Loudhouse, and discussing the popular ships, the infamous ships, and whatnot. This was a long time coming after months of putting everything together. Even though that there is a lot to discuss when it comes to these pairings that different opinions from others would discuss, I feel like that the more I look into the shipping and romance in the show, the more it builds up to why that this video exists for a reason, and regardless if it's not happening sooner than expected, it'll most likely be me just thinking of what the show would have been like, and it's just me focusing on the ships of what I enjoy the most out of them, which I do enjoy some of the ships in this show now, but if I did this earlier, it would have been outdated. Like, even though that I didn't talk about every pairing in this show, but at the same time, it just goes to show that it's just difficult to get into these pairings to where that you can't admit to yourself that you're gonna be able to find positivity in nearly everything. And due to the shipping wars that this show still displays even after almost 10 years, you still can't be able to find positivity if you're a healthier fan of being into these normal ships. Like, I would say for a fact that if I attempted to look into this a lot more, then this video would have been more longer. But for how long as it is now, dragging it out more would just instantly become repetitive to where that I don't even think I can bring anything interesting to the table. And after discussing the pairings that I need to discuss that are relevant to this video, then I don't even think that the other pairings would make a difference. While this was painful to put together, at the very least, if I put this out on time on Valentine's Day, it wouldn't be fully finished, and it will only give me more stress onto just getting the video done on time for that date. So having it uploaded now is really better than having the video not happen at all. So it's not like that the more you look into these ships and what you expect my opinions of them, I really did what I could in order to think of anything when it comes to these pairings to well that the despair nature of them is really of how much that the people working on the show can't take these pairings seriously, even if they aren't doing the most infamous pairings. Sometimes the more you look into the fandom while still being disturbed by it, you're supposed to see what is right for the show and the fandom, but when you combine both of focusing on the show and the fandom itself, honestly, it's difficult to see what is the right solution. Like, there was more of a reason of me distancing the entire Sins Kids from this show to well that looking at it on its own, it's bad, but at the same time, you making it out to be more worse is too difficult to take it at face value when you're also focusing on the show itself. Thinking about it more to well, it just gets really irritating and convoluted, sums up a lot that I really can't be able to take shipping seriously in this show when you're supposed to when it comes to infamous ships. The point of the despair in the title is mainly a showcase that even if you have a ship that is not Loudcest, you'll still get caught out for it to well, toxic fans are just another thing that people who are focusing on the inappropriate stuff in the fandom aren't recognizing onto why that those ships aren't getting much attention than the Loudcest material. Even if you think otherwise of my opinions on these material, you need to understand that the more I get into this show and the more I focus on the pairings and romance, just because I'm not a romance guy in public doesn't automatically mean that I'm not when it comes to fiction. And for me personally, this just gets a lot more irritating to well that it just becomes more of an afterthought to well it shouldn't, and yet at the same time, the show expects you to see the goods when it comes to having the characters being paired, and yet when they're not even attempting to showcase on having the pairings being consistent, specifically on Lenny's part, then I'm really more convinced that there was really no winner when it comes to the shipping war in this fandom. I'm not new to this shipping stuff. It's really obvious that I'm not, because after going through so many shipping material from other shows and heading into this show, it's not new. And for people who've experienced it for the first time, I can understand them being creeped out with the inappropriate shippings. But as far as I'm concerned, if you expect me to believe that they never experienced shipping before when it comes to some people who are familiar with it, then I don't believe you. Regardless of you being creeped out with the inappropriate shippings, it doesn't change the fact that if you're not new to this stuff, honestly, you pretty much expected the worst. For me, this really became the last show where me experiencing shipping has reached the height of basically everything wrong with shipping and yet everything not right for people who ship characters correctly. Which really sums up a lot that if there's another show that has the same problems as the Loudcest when it comes to shipping, I don't think it's ever going to top the Loudcest. Which really sums up a lot that this show really has a polarizing fandom when it comes to shipping. Even though that some people would think otherwise, I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't even come to the conclusion that I've came when it comes to the despair nature of it all. Like, focusing on the romance in the show is one thing, but when you dug deeper into the shipping, obviously you're in through a difficult ride of inappropriateness, disturbance, and yet at the same time, when you look into the healthier ships, it's difficult to take it at face value knowing full well that toxic fans, or shippers in this case, would instantly go against you to well that you can't be able to find any peace if you're the most healthiest fan who ship healthier ships. The more I looked into this, the more I scraped the bottom of the barrel to well that I've been scraping it more than my villains video to well that this really is a new level of showcasing of what the fandom is and the show itself to well that there is no winner whatsoever. And thinking about it more and more not only gets repetitive, but at the same time it hurts my head rather than the inappropriate nature of it all. My opinions were all over the place when it comes to the shipping of this show, to well that it's impossible to admit that if you think otherwise, these stuff would have been better handled, but unfortunately the fandom can't be able to control themselves. Honestly, if I look into this into a different way, then I'm pretty sure that this video wouldn't even exist. Because for me, there was really no alternative way of making this video make more sense when it comes to how everything is set up, of how everything was developed, and the direction that really makes it difficult for me to find any positivity, even though that the positivity in some ships are there, but the negativity from toxic fans and shippers just becomes more draining. Despite not talking about the McBrides or the other pairings that would have had some attention on, at this point, this video is really loaded as it is to well, you can easily say for a fact that if I forgot about the McBrides, with them being overprotective being the only trait, really sacrifices the goodwill that they have. And I would say for a fact that with them being the first LGBT couple in the show, it was good at first, but compared to how they were developed later on, I still prefer Luna and Sam despite having problems with their pairing as well. And really thinking that this show would have been better off without the shipping, then I'm pretty sure that the fandom would still dig deep in order to make those ships a reality, hence onto why Luann and Maggie exist. So, if I always considered on making a shipping and romance video when it comes to a different cartoon, it's really low, but they will never convince me that they are more convoluted than the Loudcest, because as far as I'm concerned, this show has the most convoluted romance and shipping material, and yet the despair nature of it all shows that there is no good whatsoever no matter what direction you take that is right. Even though I still ship the characters in the show, specifically Lincoln, Girl Jordan, Lori, Bobby, Lenny, River, Sam, Luna, they're only little when it comes to the other ships that have potential and have positivity towards, but as far as I'm concerned, it's honestly difficult to be proud of yourself when it comes to the ships that you're passionate about. And truth be told, making a separate video when it comes to Loudcest material or the other dystopian stuff would only come into mind if I'm really interested, which is not. I'm not saying that I'm against the people who are against it, but at the same time, there's a reason onto why I've never been part of these types of topics, because it's mostly a waste of thought, but not in the way of just thinking that all of this is okay, because it's still a waste of thought, and it just gets really difficult to admit that something good will come out of it if you pick the right choices rather than those choices. And what I have now when it comes to my favorite chips is really the most positivity that I can give in this show, or from it, but at the same time, giving the show positivity is just difficult to admit because there are still people who are against me for shipping Lincoln and Gold Jordan, and truth be told, that just goes to show that there is no freedom when it comes to picking the right choices. Which sums up a lot that it just gets really, really irritating of thinking the inappropriate nature and the infamous ships when you can't be able to separate that from your ship that is healthier, but you get toxic fans and haters. At this point, if I can imagine if that type of material would work, it would have to give you more of a high ground, which is really non-existent when it comes to taking the moral high ground. And truthfully, the high ground that I want to take is just expressing what I enjoy the most. Specifically, my 5th Lincoln and Gold Jordan fanfic with the inclusion of Lori and Bobby, Lenny and River, and Ryan, Cupid Cutie's dreams on the Dream Cruise. Let me just say that there was a lot of surprises in this fanfic, and I really feel like that the more time I have with this fanfic, the more it gets better once it's published. But at this point, I've addressed everything I needed to say in this conclusion. The toxicity video that you people voted the least in favor of this will happen, but I want to focus on other videos since they've been shafted in favor of this. And with the storage problems that I had from this project, among other problems, more of a reason onto why that there are less longer videos that are above 1 hour from me, knowing full well that it would give me a hard time. All I can say is that I'm like Lincoln in this screenshot, tired, relaxed, and happy that all of it is over. I'm Lonely Fanboy 48 here, and I'll see you guys next time.
You is the start of life for me.